Hello, everybody, and welcome back. This is my offering for February 11th. Um, a few things to go through. First of all, is as of today, the third reflection exercise was due. I've only received three, I believe. Excuse me, I've had the flu. Um, I've only received three, I believe, and hope to get the rest of them in a very short order. I find them very encouraging, and I almost wish I was back in the pulpit so I could implement some of these great ideas and insights. I have some issues that I have to deal with in my personal life, having to do with care for my mother now, and I'm going to be transferring myself to Fort Francis in 2 weeks. And I will not be getting there until the 24th. Our next time together is the 25th, so I will do what I can to have something for you on that date, but you have the syllabus and you know where we're headed. I will try to get it done before I go, but if I don't, it'll be a few days later. Now, topic is to look at more at the biblical component of theological reflection today. And so I have a few things to go into. First of all, I would have to say that, in my humble opinion, that theological reflection, Christian theological reflection, has to cohere to the biblical witness and the Bible as being read in our best understanding of Jesus Christ. Now, that's nice and sloppy. That's got a lot of floppy room to it, but our best understanding of Jesus Christ obviously is not necessarily what we want. It is implicitly judgmental of ourselves and others, and by judgment, I don't mean that it rejects. It means that it sees things as they are, and God's judgment makes all things right. So that's the way we read the scriptures. Other revelations are very important. I would encourage anyone to read the Bhagavad Gita, especially the Quran in this day and age. There's a tremendous amount of out and dishonesty out there about what the Quran contains. And it's really an obligation, I think, of every Christian preacher, every Christian theologian to have a true understanding of what's in those in that document called the Quran. However, they're not really our problem. Our issue is to be involved in Christian scripture, what we call the Old Testament, which is a Christian compendium of Jewish literature. It doesn't exist in Judaism. It is part of what we did in order to make sure that we did not give up our dependency upon Jewish literature. This was the only scripture that Christians had for the first 200 years of its existence. But as well, looking to other works such as, and Bill Phipps would have said this, for instance, that there are other revelations. Looking to something like the Bhagavad Gita or the Quran as revelations are different revelations. They're not really our concern, although we should be aware of what's in them and how they're written. But that doesn't mean that we are subject to them. That is not part of our discipleship. And holding them on an equal level is a kind of an appropriation, really, a kind of a cultural appropriation, really. And I cannot imagine telling a Muslim what the Quran says, unless that particular Muslim happens to be really wrong. And that can happen, right? But I don't really think that a Muslim interpretation of the Trinity, for instance, is one that can cohere with a Christian biblical interpretation of the Trinity. It's a deep well, it's a rabbit hole, and we shouldn't be going down it. We should be focusing on what is our concern. But by all means, always be willing to learn about and participate in dialogue and discourse with others and other scriptures as well. At the end of the day, we are concerned with this revelation and how it leads us to love and care about others, including others who are not Christian, probably most especially others who are not Christian. Faith is a matter of standing, making ourselves naked before God, in a way, making ourselves vulnerable, therefore always seeing ourselves as Scripture sees us. And Scripture does not always see us in a pretty light. My friend and mentor, Bill Morrow, who for many years was the professor of Old Testament at Queen's Theological College, used to say quite often that Scripture is easier to read about than it is to read. However, if we're going to have a relationship with Scripture, we need to read Scripture. We have to be participating with Scripture. We have to learn them. We have to come to understandings. And those understandings are not always what we want to hear and see. Now, I'm going to just mention a few of them. For instance, the book of Revelation, for about 35 years, I wouldn't even read it. I wouldn't have anything to do with it. But about 4 or 5 years ago, I started coming to an understanding, especially since I knew so many good preachers and pastors who had a real relationship with the book of Revelation. And I came to understand it by reading it itself. And then I also did some extra research from authors, particularly Elaine Pagels, and began to realize that it never made sense to me because I always had the Athanasian interpretation of the book of Revelation as being against heretics and justifying the persecution of heretics. And I could never fit that in. And then I started reading it for what it is. It's a Jewish anti-Hellenic document that Athanasius interpreted without knowing that, and basically forced it into the canon. Now I find that the book of Revelation is quite interesting. The book of Job is a really good example of a book that probably contributed to the New Testament in ways that we're only just beginning to understand. I read the book of Job since I was an atheistic teenager, a rationalist atheistic teenager. I didn't know I was that at the time, but that's what I was. And it was not helped by the fact that the book itself in Hebrew is almost untranslatable into English. It looks to be a kind of a very isolated form of Hebrew that wasn't part of the common parlance. And I only started to really understand it. And believe me, I loved it. I always loved it, but I didn't know why. I only really started to understand about 4 years ago, and how it has a relationship to the way that the temptations are told, particularly in Luke and Matthew. Not so much in John. I know you think you probably don't think that there is a temptation narrative in John, but I certainly see one, and I'm not the only one. Mark is a different kettle of fish. But the book of Job seems to have that relationship, that kind of mentoring of the story of the temptations, which I believe is the most important pericope in any of the New Testament texts. I've often been asked, I don't have time to read the Bible. They'll say, what should I read? And I say, well, read the book of Job. How long is that going to take me? I said, well, it took me about 35 years. I don't have time for that. What else should I read? I said, read the Temptations of Luke. They're a little bit clearer than Matthew's. The Temptations are pivotal in all 4 texts and provide bookends in Matthew, Luke, and John. So they're very important, definitely. Always make note of the way in which the New Testament text stands on the shoulders of what we call the Old Testament. Until after the follies of the Marcionitic movement in the 2nd century, there were no other scriptures but what we call the Old Testament. There were no other scriptures but the texts of the Jewish people, of the Jewish history. Those were canon. There was, after 40, 50, 60 CE, some attention paid to the letters of Paul. And by 80 or 90, there was scraps and pieces of the various Gospels. It is possible that the Gospel of John existed in a fragmentary form prior to the other Gospels, maybe as early as the first letters of Paul. But we have to be aware that those texts are all dependent, rely upon the authority, if you want to use that word, or the relationship that faith has to the books of the Jewish people that we now call the Old Testament. When you do your reflection, always remember that a text has more meaning and other meaning than the author intended, and so it requires a hermeneutic lens. In this case, it's often recursive, sometimes it's simply circular, that Christ himself is the hermeneutic lens, that we read Scripture with having Jesus on like glasses to interpret what's there. And to keep us from having our own personal interpretation. This is not about what we tell Scripture to say. This is about trying our best to have Scripture lovingly tell us what we need to hear about conditions of the modern era, about history, about the future, and about ourselves and our loved ones. So it's important to remember that. And if you're an author, I know some of you are aspiring to that, and 20 years goes by, 25 years go by, and you're going to find something that you wrote. And you might not even know you wrote it. And you're going to go, wow, this is good. Oh my gosh, I wrote that. And you're going to find right then and there that you have written words that have meaning beyond what you know you could have intended. That there's something deeper and broader in that. Always read the whole story. If it's a gospel story, read the entire pericope. Read the whole letter of Paul. The common lectionary sustains us on snack food. High quality, highly nutritious snack food. However, this love affair that we seek to have with Scripture requires frequent and fine dining. Do that. Read the whole book. And sometimes that can be a real burden. I recall I was going to I was facilitating a learning group on the book of Jeremiah, and I had only read select parts of it for the that were required reading. And I was leading the group that day. I was a teaching assistant at Emmanuel College. And on the way down, I inspired myself to pick up the book of Jeremiah and read it all the way through the way. That was the beautiful thing about commuting. And it's a long book, and it took a long time. And I found some, holy cow, was I wrong moments in reading that. So I was taking a lot of notes. It's great. It's great. It's actually a lot of fun. But it is time consuming. And if our relationship is to be more than a utilitarian one, I always hear people talk about the way I read Scripture or the way I use Scripture. If it's going to be more than my utility of Scripture, if it's going to be a living love affair, it's also fluid. It's going to change from time to time. My relationship with my wife of 42 years is different now than it was 20 years ago, or than it was 40 or 45 years ago. Now, sometimes you have to resort to a utilitarian relationship, as we do with people. We often have to treat one another with a certain degree of reification, but primarily that's not sought after. We want to have a real relationship with this body, with this they that we call Scripture. So I'll give you an example of that. It's not a particularly endearing piece of literature, but when I was on an internship, my first internship in '91, I was in Nova Scotia, was living out in the country, no TV, no radio. I had my musical instruments, and I had time on my hands. I had a bicycle to get around and a beautiful car. And and I was preaching, and one of the things that came up was Deuteronomy 25. And in this part of the story, the prophet Samuel tells Saul, the King Saul, to attack the Amalekites and utterly destroy them. The Hebrew word for this is harim. That is, to devote it all to God. This is one of those intensely violent points of the Old Testament witness that so many people nowadays seem to want to avoid. And this was what the practice of harim meant, is that the defeated people would be utterly destroyed. Every man, every woman, every child, every dog, every cat, every chicken, everything would be destroyed. All the goods would be destroyed. All the gold, everything would be set to the fire and destroyed. And so this is what harim meant, total dedication to God. And Saul doesn't do this. Saul does kill all the men, but the women and children and slaves are kept, as well as the best livestock. Now, at the time, and I don't really remember what was going on at the time socially, but I proclaimed Saul, in spite of the biblical witness, to be the first great moral hero of the Bible. And I was pretty chuffed at myself for coming up with this idea and this phrase. However, the years went by, and my relationship to the scripture changed, and to that particular reading changed. And I realized that the practice of a ream, however horrifying it is, also meant that no one could benefit and profit from war. William C. Platcher, in one of his books, I think it's The Vulnerable God or something like that, said that God communicates in Scripture the way that people are able to hear. And that's why we see so much of this violence in Scripture. The idea that no one could profit from war was actually a fairly high moral value, even if this total destruction of people and property was not. And by defying the law of harem, Saul was the first person in biblical history to make war profitable for the already rich, while at the same time exposing the most vulnerable to harm. It changed my way of thinking changed because of the changing relationship I had to Scripture. And so always be open to that. That's one of the really, I think, neatest things about having a relationship with Scripture instead of having a use for it. And while contemplating the seed of violence and suffering throughout the Old Testament, we have to remember that it is a tragically violent, dangerous, and often disappointing world. And one of the beauties, I think, that we find, it's a terrible beauty, but one of the beauties I think that we find in Christian Scripture, including the Old Testament, is an acknowledgement of this reality as being more and other than the will of God, such as you find in other kinds of revelations, if you want to use that term for this. Okay, so that's it for now. I want you to continue to think about the biblical witness and the way that your theological reflection conforms or adheres or endears itself to the biblical witness. When we look at that so-called quadrilateral that I've been talking about, and hopefully you're moving beyond that by now, it's important to remember that the other three categories are subsumed within biblical reflection. Biblical reflection is primary, and in a previous time I mentioned the two, the correlative and the deductive method. There are more, but those are the two that are most popular to refer to. I'm back on February 25th, God willing that I make it to Fort Francis okay and in time to be able to put something out to you. In the meantime, enjoy your reading week and work ahead. There's another reflection to come. The next reflection is actually due the last week of class. You can turn that one in sooner because you also have a paper due on that date. And in the meantime, be well. Many blessings to you all. Bye for now.